Well, hello and welcome to Perennial Beans. I'm Michael Washburn, the Preservation Director at Seed Savers Exchange, and I'll be your host for this session. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our community agreements. So, we ask that all participants in growing together, sharing seeds, stories, and skills be respectful, be curious, be patient, and speak from your own experiences, and try to avoid jargon and be conscious of intent versus impact, and take space and make space and take care of self. And by embracing these community agreements, we embrace a collective responsibility to create spaces that are respectful, inclusive, and empowering for all. A special thank you to UNFI, United Natural Foods Incorporated, for sponsoring today's conference. And we're here today with Kenneth Asmus. Now, Kenneth is founder of Oikos Tree Crops, a nursery located on 13 acres in southwestern Michigan. And he's planted more than 1,000 tree species, including woody plants and perennials, and has produced seeds of these plants and their wild relatives. Now, today, Kenneth will be talking about how you can create more resilient perennial protein crops in a short time period. In this session, Kenneth will draw on research conducted through broad collaboration and collective selection at his nursery and farm to show how to produce, select, and develop perennial beans successfully using thicket and lima beans. Kenneth, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here today and sharing with you some of my experiences growing the thicket bean. I put up a couple of images just to kind of show you and maybe give you my pointed view of this. We have Shonabari here, art display at Frederick Meyer Gardens on the left, and on the right we have my intern Nick. We have two people that are kind of highlighting diversity in agriculture, using wild crops or semi-wild crops and growing them just to see how they will be in a real world situation. Now, Nick was, I think, an intern for me in the early 2000s, and it was one of our first perennial bean crops that we put out of the thicket bean, Phaseolus polystachyotes. Let's go on to the next slide. It is a unknown crop, really, crop plant. No one knows what the yields would be like. It's a species bean. It's never really been cultivated to any extent. And it's at least 9,000 years old in its use. It was lost to time, probably prior to annual beans. This is a species of bean that is native to North America, and it has scattered populations throughout the Northeast and even into Michigan a little bit. Next slide, please. It's usually found along open bluffs and along streams. In Michigan, it was seen last in 1890 on Belle Isle on the Detroit River. On this particular island, today the land use has changed and there's a giant yacht club there where the bean used to be, I'm pretty sure. And if you have yacht club and beans, I'm pretty sure the yacht club's going to win out there. But it is an interesting plant and probably was carried by people in their pockets. It has a very shiny coat and it probably could be carried quite easily and distributed by humans, even 9,000 years ago. Under cultivation, it is easy to grow in sand or sandy loam soil. It produces a very thick carrot-type root that grows 10 or 15 feet deep. And the seeds are really much like wild tepary beans, if you've ever tried to grow those. They're very hard coat or shiny coat, and you need to scar them with sandpaper to help kind of get the water in there. You can plant them as they are, and they will come up over a 2 or 3 year period. The vines can grow up to 25 feet long or more, and the roots can live more than a decade. It reproduces by seeds, not by runners. And generally, it's not known to tip layer, but there are species of beans like the hurricane bean from Jamaica that's very similar, and that one can tip layer and grow from there. All right, your next slide, please. If you're going to try to grow this wild bean, which I suggest you do, you're going to need a very solid 10-foot trellis because of all the foliage. The foliage can be susceptible to leaf spot, so full sun is necessary, and high humidity areas are kind of rough on it because of the certain diseases that get into like these little spots of fungus. But that's normal. The plants flower in late July and August. So the beans do require really a good solid 90-day ripening period, and they ripen over a month period. So September and October here in southwestern Michigan. We collect them and bring them indoors to dry them because of the shells. The shells are the type that split and twist. So they fly all over the place if you're not careful. So we put them in the barn, and we have them on trays where they're covered with a screen usually, and you can hear them ripen as you walk in the barn in the fall. It's like a bunch of clicking sounds going off all at once when the heaters kick on. So it's kind of funny. People go, "What's that sound?" Drives them crazy. Well, those are beans ripening. The plant itself, the plant itself is pollinated by carpenter bees, bumblebees, and Hoover flies. Those are the most common, but several species of butterflies and honeybees do also pollinate it. And only a portion of the flowers set actual pods and beans. So there's some varieties they say they've improved this on, people have worked on. I don't know if that's true or not, but for me, I think part of it is the age of the root. An older root will support a bigger crop. So a 2 or 3-year-old root would be more productive than a 1-year plant. All right, next slide, please. The average yield, this is kind of the disappointing part if you grow beans. The average yield is around 1 pound, maybe per 40-foot section of trellis. This would be after 3 or 4 years. It's a very delicious bean, and it is a little bit maybe like a lentil bean combined with a lima bean flavor-wise. It cooks very quickly in under 10 minutes. And I'm wondering if it's a high protein bean. I don't know, because no one has really ever analyzed it as far as I can tell. The price is around $500 a pound if you were to buy it on the open market because no one is growing them, but it is very labor intensive. So when I first found out about the price, I was like, well, geez, I think I might make some money from this seed crop, but not really because the time you harvest and you process and everything, it's quite labor intensive, and the $500 goes fairly quickly out the door. But it is a valuable crop for seeds, and there is a market for the native seeds and other permaculture applications, a fairly strong market when I was selling it. We also sold the roots. We were growing the roots in the ground and selling them as groups of 10 or so. Same way you would sell and grow asparagus roots. It's more or less used at home, sort of an experimental and ornamental wild bean, but it is possible you could try to hybridize it with lima bean. And it's not that hard to grow again, as I mentioned before. It's a very tiny bean. It does have the exploding pods, which fragment them all over, so you have to get there right on time. But there are non-twisty pods that supposedly have been selected by people. And I have yet to see those, but it's possible they do exist. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, so just to give you an idea here, we'll go into some of the images from my farm and the bean. Here's a nice little kidney bean there. I think that's a kidney bean or a red bean of some kind. And that shows you an idea of what thicket bean looks like next to it. All right, next slide. And here's some vines on one of our trellises. You can see huge amounts of flowers. That's really a good crop there, actually. And in the background is one of my oak trees, a Bebb's oak tree. And this type of trellis or this bunching is kind of typical because you can only make the trellis so high. And then, to harvest the beans, you'd have to use a ladder. So we were doing that for a while. But this shows you a really good, solid flower set on 3 and 4-year-old roots. All right, next slide, please. And you can see the trellises, trying to get them to grow up the trellis and not out into the pathways. There was a situation where we had a lot more groundhogs and we had to use electric fence to keep them out from eating the foliage, and same with the deer. But this is a really good solid set of vines. And that is probably about as thick as it should be. Um, maybe it's a little thicker than it that could be, but as far as the yields go, this is probably where you're talking around close to a pound of seeds per 40-foot trellis or so. All right, next slide. And this gives you an idea of some of the roots here. The top of the roots at the top of the picture, and that is the bottom of the bottom here, down here in the lower portion. And this little weird splitting that you're seeing here is caused by probably the prairie vole. We have this prairie vole population there, and what they do is they'll eat the roots and get into them. But as long as they don't touch the crown, it'll just regenerate. These are 2-year-old roots, and after this point, you really can't dig them up. The shovels, like say you use a razor sharp drain spade or something like that, and you're going to dig this up, and you go, "Oh, I'm getting it out." It'll just bounce off. It's the most fibrous root ever. I don't even know how the voles get into it or why, but they do. So, all right, next slide. And then, of course, you have these beautiful little pods of beans, and they form slowly starting in September or so, and they look like that. All right, next slide. And they start to get a little brown. So this would be a very good set of pods here, actually. And you can kind of see on here a little bit how there's just a light, maybe 3 or 4 pods per, I guess that would be a raceme of flowers, technically. And you can see a little bit on the right upper hand corner and the left of some of the disease. But at this point, that's kind of the breakdown of the vine in the fall. So I normally wouldn't be spraying anything to protect them. All right, next slide. And then they'll eventually turn this blackish color here. This is the ideal time to harvest them. They haven't split yet, but they're real close. And they haven't thrown the seeds over. The seeds will fly maybe up to 10 feet away or more. So they really are propelled. Sometimes you get hit by them and they're moving. All right, next slide. And if you're in a rush, like sometimes I am, I'll harvest even green ones, and that's what it looks like. So you have these darker ones, and then you have these green ones that are more fresh. And it's from here that you dry them down for storage or for eating too. So you want to let them finish their whole thing and let them kind of turn hard, just like a lima bean, really identical to that. All right, next slide. Oh, this is my grandma Asmus. Our grandma Zachariah, she's really inspired me many years ago. And as a kid, I don't know if you've ever had to do this, but like you go to your grandparents and they go, "Oh, you must see the garden." And you're like, "Oh gosh, do I have to see the garden?" But then eventually I was really getting into seeing grandma's garden. I was like insane. And she was very proud of her garden. They lived on the Tibbetawasi River. And so they would pump water into the garden from the river, which was, downstream from Dow Chemical at the time. And my dad goes, I don't think we should be eating grandma's produce. But we did a little bit. She loved her raspberries. And really a great inspiration to me just to go there and go, wow, you grew these sunflowers? I was always astounded as a kid. So she had more of a role in me loving gardening than she probably even knows. So God bless Grandma Zacharias. All right, let's move on. And there is a possibility too that you can breed the thicket bean with lima beans, and it has been done before. And my thought was, well, I can probably, maybe I'll squeak out a population of these hybrid plants, but why not just breed a lot of different kinds of lima beans in the process and shrink the lima bean? I always thought the lima bean was too big, it takes too long to cook. But I thought, on the other hand, if you had a wild crop, you could kind of infuse some of those genetics into the plant, make it more resistant to disease or insects, or deeper rooted, or even a perennial protein crop, which I've fiddled with many different kinds of crops like that. Okay, next slide. Next slide. And one of the things that you can do is change, you don't really, I didn't know what I was doing because I'm not a plant breeder, but I really didn't want to know. So I tried many different things. I tried growing tepary beans with them. I tried to grow lima beans. And here on the left is the flower of the thicket bean. And then on the right is more of like a lima bean flower. And so the idea is that you're going to try to get these two to cross. And so I would be standing out there, I'm going, well, there's no bugs going back and forth. This is not going to work. But I kept doing it over and over again after 3 or 4 years. Okay, next slide. And then lo and behold, I started getting lima beans with pink flowers. So I knew I was kind of heading off in that direction. And I don't think that's very common, but I don't know. But anyway, that's what was happening. And I started with the Christmas lima and then some other ones like the Traveler's lima. And I started using those as kind of the first generation and then kind of moved away from there into these purple ones. And I even had a couple years ago, I think it was, I got a variety of lima bean called Bant, I think it is, or Bunt, I can't remember. But anyway, I used that one as well. And the idea was, oh, I'm going to create a hybrid plant. Look, I've got pink flowers. I know, I was very excited about this. All right, next slide. And I noticed right away there was some huge vigor in these crosses, but there was also very, very little fruit, very few beans. But there were some that were fruiting very, very nicely. And I was very happy with that result, actually. So I was considered myself successful, even though I hadn't really reached my goal. So, next slide, please. And so then I started noticing, oh, look at all these crazy, looking lima beans that I'm getting. And so I really wasn't, again, sure about my success, but up in the top portion of this picture kind of gives you an idea of the thicket bean, and below is a lima bean. Now, the idea with this is that the lima bean is the one that can change, but the thicket, if you try to reverse it, it's not supposed to happen that way. But I don't believe that. I'm kind of a negative Nancy on plant breeders because they do such specific things. It rules out a lot of other possibilities. And so my thought was that it could happen, but maybe less likely. So now I'm starting to use just whole populations of both the lima bean and the thicket bean where I grow them next to each other. So I can kind of see what will happen with the population. The goal isn't really to create a cultivar. Instead, it's really to create a population. And I'm hoping that you will join me in my quest of this sort of thing, because it's quite, I think it would be quite easy to do with enough people working on it. I'm sure this will happen very easily. All right, let's go to the next slide. And so this was I thought, oh, these are these are good solid roots. These are going to go. And what I'll do is I'll store them in my refrigerator. These are perennial. I'm sure I did it. And of course, they weren't. They were annuals and they all died. So, but I still have my, I'm still going with it this year. All right, next slide. And I did find better yielding lima beans in the process, and more early ripening and more uniform ripening, which in itself was very nice. All right, next slide. And then I've started to getting more of a population of them with the darker skins, the the different shapes and sizes. But really, I'm not really sure if I was successful in this as far as creating a perennial bean. But I am starting to see these changes in the lima bean that I really like, and which is smaller beans, thinner, and I'm hoping more tasty. So now I have enough where I don't feel too guilty about eating the $500 beans. but but at the same time, I was like, well, is this where the population will land and just stay, or can it be more of a perennial nature, a root that will go down 10 or 15 feet? Because those are the types of plants we are going to need, not 10 years from now, right now. So that's the whole critical part of this. And one of the reasons I keep going back to the lima bean year after year is because of this. All right, next slide. And this is a beautiful piece of artwork called, let's see, Dance of the Bean Warriors or something like this. But basically, it kind of highlights, this is in the Chicago Institute of Art, and it's Peruvian vase. See, I wrote down the time of it. It's 2000 BC, Assault of the Bean Warriors. And the idea of this was that there was a ruling class that had taken over the production of beans and was controlling the food from these beans. Now, this is interesting to me because looking at the images, what I saw was mattocks, some sort of planting tool, and dibbles. But other people seemed to think there was a coup for the beans. And the lima bean itself is a perennial bean, and it probably was a giant vine. It went up into the trees or something. And my thought was then you would have these places where they would grow this relatively untended, and then when the season ended, the pods would split and the seeds would split and throw themselves out and fall to the ground. So that's just a theory, but that's kind of what I've learned by um, growing this thicket bean, was that it in itself taught me a lot about wild plants, about something that's never really been cultivated. And if you didn't really want to breed it, could you just grow it and eat it as it is? And the answer is yes, you can. It can be part of your diet. It's easy to grow, but don't expect a modern day bean bonanza with, so many pounds per acre. It's probably in this point in time, it's something that could be enjoyed, grown, and relished as part of your food, but may take a little bit of more effort and cultivation by human beings to create a better and deeper rooted lima or thicket bean or whatever someone wants to call it, and something that you could pass on to future generations. So that's all I have to say today, and I hope that piques your interest in the thicket bean. Michael, you want to take over from here?
Yeah, Ken.
All
Thank you so
right.
much for that.
You're welcome.
That was fantastic.
All right.
I love the ending there and the story of this unique vessel. Uh,
Yes, the assault of
it's
the bean warriors. I think they got it wrong.
oh man.
I
No,
think it was a dance and an entertainment, a form of entertainment. And maybe the vessel contained the beans, which held them for a period of time before they could plant them. I don't know. That's my theory.
It's like you can just drop them down in the top there, and they.
It seems like it, yeah. I was like, boy, that seems like a perfect vessel if you lived in the tropics.
Hmm.
There's no way nothing could get in there if you stopped it up correctly.
And where is this? Where is this? Do you know where this came from? Where did this come from?
Yeah, actually, it's a Google image, and it's at the Chicago Institute of Arts in Chicago, Illinois. And there's a woman that wrote a very beautiful, piece about it. An archaeologist, an actual archaeologist, not an armchair archaeologist like me, but about this particular time, and I call it the protein that doesn't run away. And if you can imagine living in the tropics, and all of a sudden you have this bean crop falling on your head, you're gonna make use of that. And the other part of it is the health benefits of a bean. I mean, we really underestimate the power of beans, um, because they're 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 just amazing little package of goodness. And so the thicket bean, I have no idea what's in that thicket bean, but man, I'm very curious about the nutrition in that.
Yeah. Well, as you said, that's your next venture to
It
find out
is.
that content.
I got to find out. So I'm going to send some to the USDA and have them or someone look it up, help me with it. So,
We got time for a couple questions here. Got some good
okay,
comments. And so we've got one from Peggy, and she says, "So, how does one obtain the bean to grow, and where is it sold? Where can
sure.
Peggy
Well,
get some?"
yes, you can. It's very simple. The Prairie Moon Nursery or Prairie Moon Seed Company sells the thicket bean seeds. Their thickets bean seed is different than mine, and it's bigger and it's kind of a black color. So I would recommend them first, and I should have seeds of it available sometime this fall. I'm not sure how much or what yet, but sometimes I'll make exchanges with people, or there's sometimes you can purchase packets of them too. But I would recommend Prairie Moon because they're very reliable source of that thicket bean seed. Yeah.
Um, as I ask the next question, Stuart here is asking for the vessel to be shown again. He wants to get a better look at it.
Okay.
Um, and then our good friend Spencer Carter wants to know, how can people help develop your project?
Well, that's a good question. When I first started growing the thicket bean, right away you could see variations, natural variations within the population, including smaller plants that flowered profusely at 1 year of age. And so there's a way to use the crop and develop it into a more productive wild crop as well. So I would attempt to grow that on a trellis, and maybe we could all share that information through Seed Savers or some other social platform of some sort, because there isn't enough people that have grown it in different locations to really get a ballpark if I'm right or how far off I am. Maybe in some places it's more heavy producing, um, but no one there. I don't think there's like there's no master plan for for it. I've never had it, but I'd be willing to talk with anyone about it and maybe work with others if there's enough interest. Sure.
Yeah, and Spencer, I can get you and Kenneth together, and yeah, maybe y'all could chat a little bit more behind the
Yeah,
scenes and see what y'all could do
absolutely.
together.
Yeah. The more
Great.
people that grow it and then write about their experiences with it, the better chance that people will begin to see a trend in certain things happening with the crop, making it more productive or usable as it is, as a wild crop, not necessarily hybridizing it. That the hybridizing thing could be separate, and certainly you could do that, but you're changing the crop to something else. And I
Yep.
really love the thicket bean flavor, so I'd hate to see that lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanna make shade with it in a big arbor system because
That's a good idea. Yeah.
those huge vines climbing up there was so beautiful in that one picture of just like the
Yes.
curtain of it. So
Oh, it's crazy too. And standing in between the two with all the pollinators, especially the bumblebees, it's insane. It's like just buzzing. They love those. Their things are way out in the open. The flowers are all just massively. There's every type of insect I think that has landed there. There's one bumblebee I haven't even identified. I don't know what it is. I've never seen it before. So I need to get out there and do a little ID work.
I've got maybe one time for one more question from Angela Wolverton here, and she said this would be fabulous to try in permaculture food forest situation, and
Yeah.
she's curious at how long it would take to get less explosive pods, because the those wild ancestors and the limas, you can tell when a lima is closer to its wild ancestor because it'll scatter on you, and maybe a more manageable vine size.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think the only way you really can't shrink the vine. That it's almost like you're going against the nature of the vine. So I don't know how you could do that, but you could make a trellis system that would be like almost on a pivot that you could lower that would allow you to pick it. We I thought about that for a while, but it was just too time consuming for my farm. But the idea is then you have a trellis and then you take the trellis down. You could use a different system for that. But you really want vigor. You want massive vines.
Mm-hmm.
As bad as that sounds, that is really what brought in the yields. When we first planted the seed that I got from Eric Tonsmeyer, um, it just engulfed this one of the plants engulfed this whole little 3 foot trellis we had. It just took over everything. It grew over this, it grew over that. Well, that's what the thicket bean does, and that's actually a good trait. As far as the explosive pods go, I'm not sure it exists, but people tell me it does. And I have seen another company that sells, I can't remember their name now, that does sell, oh, ours don't explode, our pods don't explode. So that is a possibility. And I think it's fair. I have seen it in my planting. So I think it's more common than than what people think it is. I don't think it's a 1 in 1,000 thing. It might be a 1 in 50 that there's a less explosive pod seedling in that group of thicket beans, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, great comments all around. I think Sydney's referring to Grandma's garden there.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Oh my. Yes. Well, yeah. When as a young kid, you go, we got to go fishing. The river's right there, but no, we got to go to her grandma's garden. So we were essentially forced to do that. But then I was like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. So I created a garden, even as a young kid, because I was like, well, I got to have my own garden. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I got a 9-year-old that he's a good gardener, but sometimes it's not as easy to get him out there as I'd like to.
yeah, yes, I understand.
And
You're welcome.
Heidi's, yeah.
Well, good.
Well, we about run our course here,
All
and
right.
Kenneth, it was great getting to know you through this, and
Yeah, right.
what an
Likewise.
interesting, just a great presentation. I think you
Good.
probably opened a door to a place none of us had seen inside before, so I really
Well, I hope
appreciate it.
so. Excellent. Glad to
Yes,
be here.
fantastic.
Only through seed savers can something good like this happen. And any other thing would just flop. It would.
Well, I appreciate it, Kenneth.
Yeah.
That's mighty nice. Yeah. Well, thanks for being with us. And so I'll do a little closing. Yeah. So again, Kenneth, thank you for a fantastic presentation, and
You're
what a
welcome.
good end note there.
All right.
Um, and a big thank you to our audience and our sponsor, UNFI. And that concludes today's conference. And we hope you all join us for the next conference day, which is going to be Friday, August the 2nd, where we'll kick it off with our keynote speaker and my good friend Nico Engelbert, and the exciting work he's doing with thousands of community scientists across the country and beyond through his vegetable trialing community and software platform, SeedLinked. Again, thank you so much, Kenneth,
You
and
bet.
thank you everybody for joining us today. Be well.